Welcome everyone to our final concurrent session this afternoon. I'm pleased today to moderate the session on rooting resilience, fostering the advocacy and leadership of gender-based violence survivors through peer support. We are pleased to collaborate with Dawn Canada. With us today is Valérie Grandmasson. I think I say that right. Valérie is a researcher, an activist, and mother. She is a PhD candidate in sociology at the University of Guelph. Her research takes an intersectionality feminist approach and focus on gender-based violence, activism, and notions of justice for diverse women with disabilities in Canada and internationally. She has also taught undergraduate courses on disability and gender-based violence. She's published many scholarly articles and chapters on the impacts of COVID on people with disabilities, femicide of women and girls with disabilities, and the housing situation of people with disabilities. I've had the pleasure of working on a few committees with Valérie, so she's got a lot of information to share. So I will turn it over to Valérie. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Rianne. Thank you. And I'm very grateful to have been invited to present at the conference, Inclusive Voices and Collective Power. I think we're at Dawn Canada, we're always looking at opportunities to create partnerships, create relationships in the GBV sector to really highlight the experiences of women and girls with disabilities and bring down silos, right, across sectors for more inclusive services. I want to start by acknowledging that today I speak to you from Ottawa, which is on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin people. At Dawn Canada, we come to understand the historical and ongoing impacts of colonialism in not only creating impairment through structural violence and direct violence, but also creating understanding of disabilities based in the medical model, which does not align with Indigenous perspective of body and mind differences. And we constantly have to work to unlearn our understandings of body and mind differences and understand the barriers for Indigenous people to access services that they need. So today I'm going to talk to you about our wage-funded initiative called Rooting Resilience, Fostering the Advocacy and Leadership of Gender-Based Violence Survivors through Peer Support. I'm going to start today by talking about our organization and how we work. Then I'm going to talk about dynamics of violence against women and girls with disabilities, with a focus on our 12 Days of Activism campaign on women and girls labeled with intellectual disabilities and the specific dynamics of gender-based violence that they face. Then I'll present our Rooting Resilience project. We are currently it's an ongoing project with another year. So I'm going to present not really final outcomes, but what we've been learning, what we've been doing and what we've been learning. And I'm hoping to have quite a bit of an interactive session for the last 20-25 minutes. So Dawn Canada is the Disabled Women's Network of Canada. It's an advocacy organization established more than 40 years ago by groups of women with disabilities across the country who felt excluded from both the disability rights movement and the women's movement. They felt like their issues were not recognized, they were not visible, they were not addressed in either of these movements. I start by giving this history because we know that Dawn Canada started with peer support, and I'm going to tie it all the way back in. This is why we think peer support can lead to systemic change. Dawn is now a national, intersectional, and cross-disability organization with the goal to end poverty, isolation, and discrimination experienced by women, girls, and gender diverse people with disabilities and those who are deaf. Our, our strategy is one of leadership, partnership, and networking to engage all levels of government and the wider disability and women's sector, as well as other stakeholders in addressing our key issues. To give you a little bit of context, gender-based violence was Dawn's first key issue, right? These groups of women with disabilities came together to address the violence that they face in their lives. And it continues to be one of our key focus area in everything that we do. Our other key areas are advocacy and leadership, as well as livelihoods, which is access to basic needs and access to all the supports that we need to thrive. Now I'll talk a little bit about dynamics of violence in the lives of women and girls with disabilities. I'm going to go through this quite quickly because there's a lot of research that has been on this, and I'm sure most of you are here are familiar with some of these dynamics. But what I want to focus on is the systematic nature of violence against women and girls with disability and the invisible nature of violence, and how this violence is rooted in multiple overlapping structures of exclusion, of barriers, of discrimination. So women and girls with disabilities face higher rates of multiple forms of gender-based violence. And they experience more forms of gender-based violence at the hands of different abusers and perpetrators. The most, for example, for older women with disabilities, it'll be family members that don't necessarily live with them. It's going to be from their sons, from their nephews, from their brothers. And for younger women, for girls with disabilities, it's also going to be family members. But it can also be caregivers. It can be people in institutional settings, in congregate settings, and in long-term care homes. So it's really important to understand gender-based violence beyond intimate partner violence, even though women and girls with disabilities are also more likely to experience intimate partner violence. What I really want to emphasize is the interconnected forms of oppression. Gender-based violence is really understood in the lack of options. The way that I come to understand violence for women and girls with disabilities is that they often have to choose between different forms of violence. If they live in an abusive relationship, that may mean that they are homeless or don't have the care that they need, right? So they choose a different form of more structural type of violence. And that's because of ableist, patriarchal, and other forms of oppression like racism. It's because there's a lack of options to where to live. For example, a lack of affordable and accessible housing. There's a lack of employment opportunities because of systemic ableism and racism in the employment sector. The lack of educational opportunities because of the ongoing barriers to being fully supported to learn, even in high school, where there's still a lot of segregation for students with disabilities, and higher education. There's currently a care crisis in Canada where care workers are leaving in droves, or there's a really high turnover in staff. They're very overstretched, overburdened, underpaid. And that leaves women and girls with disabilities have less option in the care that they receive and in the continuing care that they receive. These are structural issues, right? I also want to bring attention to the invisible forms of violence that women and girls with disabilities face. I specifically want to talk about forms of coercive control. I often say that no one understands or experiences coercive control as much as women, girls with disabilities, who are controlled in every aspect of their lives. For example, access to transportation in many cities, and that's exacerbated in rural regions. There are not accessible transport, or unreliable specialized transit with no booking availability, unreliability, and we hear a lot of safety issues where women are harassed or assaulted in specialized transit as well. So they often rely on their caregivers or their partners or family members to access the supports that they need. So an abuser can really control where the women go, when they go there. And then we often found that, for example, if they access health services, then they're really surveilled by these partners into what they say, because there's always someone with them. So there's really lack of privacy is another massive issue. Over medication, under medication, this whole control to the supports that you want. We hear, I'll talk about this later actually, but I just really want to bring attention to these invisible forms of violence that we may not necessarily think about. Control of assistive devices, so the person is completely isolated. Isolation is a key issue for women and girls with disability, as it is for many women and girls who are experiencing gender-based violence. I want to talk a little bit about Dawn Canada's campaign for the 12 days of action to end violence against women and our 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. In collaboration with the Learning Network, we have published a newsletter on violence against women and girls labeled with intellectual disabilities. When we talk about the term labeled, it's because the tests that are done in order to label someone with intellectual disabilities are really ableist and racist, and do not consider the entire person and the entire ways that they can contribute. It is very narrow in evaluating certain cognitive skills, and it doesn't recognize the full person. Some women and girls reject that label, really, because it is imposed on them by ways of understanding that are, again, really reductionist. It reduces them to that label. So that's why we use these terms. It's a way to understand that it's imposed on them, and it's a way to take away their decision-making power and autonomy. We focus on women and girls labeled with intellectual disabilities for this year's campaigns because they face the highest rates of violence, the most invisible forms of violence. They are often questioned. I'll go to the next slide. I see the chat. I'm just going to look what's in the chat. Link to the newsletter. Yeah. That's amazing. Thank you so much. Yeah, so here I talk about labeling as a process of exclusion. And it's used to discriminate against certain groups like Indigenous women. I mean, historically in Canada, it's no surprise that Indigenous people, Indigenous women, have been labeled with intellectual disabilities, cognitive disabilities, as a way to institutionalize them, as a way to sterilize them, as a way to completely segregate them, isolate them, exclude them from society. There's forms of this that still exist when we think about the child care system, not the child care, children, I'm sorry, I'm missing the word, but family and child services, where they assume that Indigenous women and mothers with disabilities, that happens all the time, are incompetent, are unable to care for their children, and their children are taken away. For women with disabilities, they're constantly signaled. in these family and child services as being incompetent to care for their children. For women and girls labeled with intellectual disabilities, they face many, many barriers to accessing basic needs because they are not seen as able to contribute to society. For example, there are still day programs in Canada that exploit the work of women labeled with intellectual disabilities without paying them or without pay them even minimum salary, because they say, well, you can contribute as a normal person, then you can exploit your labor. Many people will refuse to rent to someone labeled with an intellectual disabilities because they're seen as unreliable, not financially capable, and all of the ableism that they face throughout the whole education continues to put barriers in their financial independence. There's the normalization and invisibility of violence. I just wanted to see in my next slide if I talk about this or here. Yeah. So a lot of violence is committed by caregivers, people of trust, people with relationship of dependency, people that will commit violence sometimes in their best interest by removing decision-making power, by removing autonomy, independence. And it will be done in the home, which I know the home was always a political site for women activists for decades, as a place where this is where violence happens and we need to expose what happens in the home. But it continues to happen and also in institutions. These women are also labeled as asexual or hypersexual, as if they cannot control the libido, they cannot control themselves. So it's not really assault. Same with asexual. Often it's a way to discredit the sexual violence that happens to them. We hear often that the violence against them is justified as, oh, they should be grateful. No one else would touch them. No one else would want to experience that. They should be grateful. I want to talk a lot about paternalism and autonomy. This is what I like to think about violence in the name of care, or quote, the best interest of the person. Who is to determine the best interest of women and girls labeled with intellectual disabilities when all services are meant to remove their autonomy and remove their decision-making power? It creates conditions of dependency or perceived dependency. That's a really important nuance, that the person is made to feel like they need others to take decisions for them, that they need others to do their daily task or to take decisions about their lives. For example, we talk about some of the problems with substitute decision making. I want to make clear that substitute decision making has its place in a situation where someone cannot provide legal consent, for example. But we're really trying to move toward supported decision making. What does the person need in order to make decisions about their lives, about where they live, about the care they receive, about education, about employment? What supports do we need to have in place? And that's a really important shift to do, to always focus on supporting decision making rather than substituting decision making. Segregation happens throughout the lifetime. It continues to happen. Institutionalization is a growing concern for disability advocates in the country because of the lack of affordable and accessible housing, because of constant discrimination based on ableist discrimination, that women with disabilities will not be able to pay rent, will damage the unit. They cannot take care of the unit. In the conditions of housing that we live, with shortages, landlords have more and more power in making decisions of who they rent to, and that excludes a lot of women and girls labeled with intellectual disabilities. The questioning competence, Dawn has been intervening in courts for decades about supporting victims to be trusted, to be believed, because lawyers and even judges will constantly question the competence, the trustworthiness of victims that do come forward. Denying privacy, I talked about this a lot earlier, but this is a form of violence that is just seen as a form of care sometimes, but it is but losing privacy is a form of violence. And denying access to sexual education that is accessible and where they feel represented and heard. Okay. So this is my last slide before talking about the project, talking a lot longer than I thought. When I want to make another point that I want to make here is violence leads to disability. So we scream for the gender-based violence sector to really understand that so many of the people they work with, so many people of the people they serve have disabilities, whether they disclose it or not, whether they recognize it or not, whether they identify as having a disability or not, they do live with disability. We know about brain injury. There's really good work done by Castellano and other researchers out in BC about women who live with brain injury. We know that strangulation leads to similar symptoms to brain injury, and those are lifelong conditions that really affect your cognitive functioning. Mood disorders, that is absolutely no surprise to anybody. Up to 90% of survivors live with a mental health condition, and 1/3 of survivors experience suicide ideation. And there's other lifelong injuries. So survivors seeking services and supports are likely to live with a disability. So what we urge the gender-based violence sector is to take a disability justice lens with all of the survivors, not waiting for someone to disclose, not waiting for someone to access a diagnosis, but really take an approach that is trauma-informed, of course, but also anchored in disability justice approach. Okay, last slide for real before the project. So because of the barriers that I've been naming, there's a lack of access to services, a lack of access to justice. And in this today justice, I mean criminal justice system. Yeah. So there's inaccessible information, inaccessible services, inaccessible shelters still. The formats that talk about sexual education, that talk about forms of gender-based violence, about healthy boundaries, can be inaccessible to many women. Either many deaf women, for example, are not really familiar with English, so they prefer LSQ or ASL formats, or this information needs to be in plain language, right? And also in visually accessible formats. There's a lack of interpretation services when they try to access a shelter or services. Survivors with disabilities are passed around a lot by different agencies for being too disabled. Many professionals we hear they feel like they're not equipped, they're not trained to serve people with disabilities, and they end up being referred to either disability agencies who feel like they are not equipped, are not trained to deal with survivors of gender-based violence. It is this constant passing around because of silos, right? They're either too disabled or not disabled enough. What I mean by this is they might be labeled with complex needs. We hear that from, unfortunately, shelter workers. They feel like some survivors have really complex needs. That means multiple disabilities that manifest in ways and are not supported, that may be exacerbated when they are in the shelter. Or they're not disabled enough, meaning that they don't have the diagnosis to access services, the medical diagnosis, when there are so many barriers to accessing a diagnosis, especially when you're racialized, Black, Indigenous, because you're constantly made to think that it's in your head or it's in your own fault, and you're kind of gaslit into in your situation and not really given the proper medical care and support. There's a lack of understanding and recognition. I talked about this. Service providers lack training and confidence to work with survivors with disabilities. And then there's barriers to justice, continued discriminating attitudes about survivors' trustworthiness, and there's communication and accessibility barriers along the criminal justice system process. Okay, next slide. So I'm gonna talk about rooting resilience. This is a wage-funded project from 2020 to 2024. I'm just going to talk about the later part of the project because around the pandemic, we did much more research work rather than community engaged work. But here I want to focus on the community engaged work that we've been doing for the last year and going into the next year as well. So this is a partnership with 3 organizations across sectors, namely Women at the Center, who presented earlier today. They work as a peer support model for survivors. Independent Living Center of Kingston. Independent Living is a disability movement, really, that provides all sorts of services to all people with disabilities. And then Indigenous Disability Canada, who is a national network that supports Indigenous people with disabilities to access economic security and education and all of that. The goal is to build the advocacy and leadership capacity of women with disabilities who are survivors of GBV. So we're doing this in implementing peer support models for gender-based violence survivors and advocates with disabilities. And we're engaging in a community of practice to learn from each other and build our skills to support survivors and advocate for systemic change. So as I mentioned, all of our partners are implementing their own approach of peer supports. They all do peer support in very different ways. Here, I'm very careful to not define peer support because they have such a different understanding, they have a different approach, and our understanding of peer support is also changing to this project as we work together. But the goal is to increase the well-being of survivors, access to livelihood, so access to housing, access to financial security, access to the things they want to do, and also support the advocacy and leadership of GBV survivors with disabilities. Through the community of practice, we are creating a space when we share and learn among partner organizations. So we really try to break down silos between the disability, Indigenous, and women's sector. And through that, we're going to be identifying leading practices in intersectional and disability justice approaches to peer support. And we'll be sharing that in the next coming months. And with the ultimate goal of promote the advocacy and leadership of women with disabilities and organizations. And I'll talk more about what that looks like. Peer support is a really trendy thing right now. We recognize that. But again, it's something that Dawn has done for almost 40 years. And we don't want to assume that we're doing the right way either. We're really careful about defining it and understanding what works and what doesn't work and really continuing to learn. But the need for peer support is really evident in in the lack of services, the lack of supports, the isolation that survivors with disabilities feel. Peer support can be adapted to the needs of a community. I'll talk more about that. It is developed from the lived experiences and skills of other women with disabilities who are GBV survivors. And it's an evidence-based practice. There's growing academic and community literature about the strengths, the opportunities of peer support as it promotes long-term well-being. It breaks isolation. It focuses on solution rather than deficits, rather than harm, than wounds. And it leads to advocacy and leadership. And we see this clearly in our project so far. So I want to talk about three key findings, if you like, so far in this project. First is peer support on the continuum. Our partners support survivors at different stage of their healing journey. Some are just escaping an abusive relationship and are trying to find where to live, right? That is really different type of peer support than someone else is working with advocates, GBV advocates, who have been living free of violence for 10 or 15 years and are now really wanting to be effective in implementing change in the region, in their city, at the provincial territorial levels. It's also about the peer support between organizations. We constantly learn from each other. It's having the women's sector starting to use disability language. It's about the disability sector starting to understand Indigenous lens to violence, to healing, to peer support, to well-being, right? It's this developing a collective understanding of violence and of prevention and roads to justice. The system I want to go back. Yes. The system navigation piece is massive, and it happens constantly. What we dream of is wraparound services, where someone can go to one person, one place, and have support to find housing, have support to access this, to do all the paperwork to access disability assistance or social assistance, to get into a program, educational program, to get even a diagnosis that will open the doors to get all the supports that they need. One of our partners, Women at the Center, calls system navigation, they call it going rogue. They go outside of the mandate, and it's mostly counseling and emotional support, to really doing what the survivors need. It is centering the survivor in what they need. That is really the most important thing that's coming out of peer support, is that it supports the survivor where they are, and it's holding people, like supporting people as long as they can. That works into breaking down silos, right? It's not the housing system that will fix housing. It is maybe through peer support that we can work breaking down those silos. Then and the system navigation also helps with the hopelessness in accessing services. I talked about survivors being passed around services a lot. And this system navigation, they have an advocate that is teaching them the language, teaching them how to advocate for themselves, like learning. And then eventually the survivor is able to use that language, is able to use those tools to write those letters, to complete the forms, to look for the information. So it's really getting them out of the isolation and the hopelessness. And then we're talking about advocacy and leadership. The survivors are eager Of course, once they have a roof and once they have their basic needs met, they are eager to make change in their community. We have an example of a woman who wants to organize a bit of we call them like sit-in in a city. Yes, the question to make people make city councilors understand disability by having an event where people would have to navigate the city on a wheelchair. And then the person thought it was so important because the city is often not, the snow is often not cleared and the city is not accessible. I try to take public transport in the wheelchair. So they really want city councilors to know what it feels like to have to navigate the city on a wheelchair. That's an idea from a survivor. They come up with ideas to impact change, and we're there to support their ideas and make them happen. It's also about building skills, advocacy, and leadership between organizations that are now working together. We're just brainstorming about our funding, about how do we make effective impact on the provincial and territorial implementation of the National Action Plan on Gender-Based Violence. That's an example of collective work that we're doing now that's coming out of this project. We also hear from our partner organizations that in implementing their peer support model, they build the capacity of their own organizations to do advocacy. They mention that doing this system navigation connects them with different agencies in their communities, with many different organizations in their communities, and they are starting to work more collaboratively, creating partnerships and really more connected in the community. And that helps their advocacy provide the services that survivors need. So we see the advocacy leadership at very different levels. I think I'm gonna leave it at that so we have a little bit of time for questions. Here I have a quote from, I really like this quote from a Black woman who's a single mother. She was talking about peer support and saying, sometimes in group settings, oopsie, you don't need to know, when we're discussing things, I would hear things, it would move me to tears, you know, just other people's stories and things like that. And I walk away feeling stronger and more educated. You know, it opens your mind and gives me strength. Okay, well, I'm gonna skip to I'm gonna skip the community of practice, but it's really about building our capacity. And of course, you can ask me any questions that you may have, but I also have questions for you, for anyone in the audience. I would love if you wanted to share by voice or by chat. I'd love to know if you have any experiences with peer support, either with GBV survivors or with women with disabilities, and what benefits did it bring to survivors? Do you have any, and what do you do to support survivors with disabilities? What are good practices of peer support models? What are challenges of peer support models? And then here, how do you think peer support can play a role in supporting the advocacy and leadership of survivors? Yeah, what are your experiences of peer support? What are the challenges, best practices, and then how can it lead to advocacy?
Thanks, Valerie. Yeah, just if anybody wants to post any comments in the chat box to some of the questions that Valerie's posed, or if anybody has any specific questions on the information that Valerie's presented, please post that. I was just wondering, in terms of the peer support, I know some in the past there have been peer support programs for women experiencing gender-based violence. How do you maintain that sustainability of those programs? You know, I know sometimes funding is an issue, or either gathering older women in a forum that they feel sort of safe, or they feel like they're the only one, or just even getting the momentum, getting that set up. Is that easy process, or has that been a struggle for some communities?
I just want to say that funding is an issue. Funding is an issue. So for right now, our programs are really, really doing well. We have wait lists for some of the peer support programs. So people are eager to be part of this space, are eager to be part of this. So in terms of sustainability from the survivors themselves, they're keen, they're eager, they want to be in. But I'm not going to lie to you, past next year, we still have to apply for funding. Well, we apply for funding constantly. We still have to receive funding. It's a major concern. And some of our partners have stopped programs because they lost funding. So I'm not going to lie, it's a major issue, but we're hoping we're successful in our partnership, in showing the effectiveness of this approach and of this cross-sector approach. Fingers crossed.
Yeah, and I think that's the important piece of that is that cross sector and collaborating with other community partners to make this happen. And the programs, I guess the other question I had that I wrote down while you're speaking was around the educating the justice partners and justice services about that accessibility piece. So if a woman goes to court, like how do we educate, or has there been movements towards that education? I know the system has some built-in legislation around keeping things accessible, but maybe that doesn't meet everybody's needs, particularly the women that you're working with. Has there been any movement that way?
Not systematically. I think for us, Dawn Canada specifically is really focused on shifting attitudes. So we're really focused on training in terms of understanding ableism, right. Breaking down myths. But you talked about accessibility, and it's with law enforcement, it's with courts, and it's corrections. Accessibility means options. It means options in terms of the way you communicate, in the services that you have, and how you approach. And right now we are not doing that work. But we just received a grant to look at accessibility in federal prisons, federal corrections. So that's a way to at least make sure that women with disabilities who are incarcerated have at least access to the needs, to the support that they need. We know that people that are women and girls who are incarcerated are often survivors of violence too. So that's one part, but it's not. We're not doing that work systematically, and again, funding and partnerships. That's what we need.
Exactly. Well, thank you. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for sharing all this information, this wealth of knowledge that you have. I have put the posting for the website and all the resources that you have. I'd encourage people to go check that out. So thank you for sharing that today. We greatly appreciate it. I'm going to end the session. If people want to click onto our final address for the day, you'll see that in the last session, and we'll have that started in about 5 minutes. So thank you again, Valérie. And
thank you so much.
And this will be posted on our website after. Thank you.
Bye-bye.